I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
All right, there we go. What's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like Live.
I mix what I...
Oh, I'm messing up. You know what it is? Honestly, I'm got so many different things going on, and I've somewhat just overextended myself for a moment. So just forgive me. Plus, I'm excited about our next guest. And the fact that my class from Morgan State University is here, which is, of course, really bad timing to be so messed up in my intro, but it is what it is. So anyway, welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining me. My students in the world according to hip hop, welcome. And to everybody else, welcome. And those who will see this later in the replay, the welcome to all of you as well. A couple of things, before our guest comes up, that I'm just also very excited to talk about or share very quickly. One, I've been talking about a number of for a while that we have some announcements and expansion going on. Well, some of it I can begin to announce because part of that expansion project is going to premiere tomorrow, Friday, February 5th, that is, at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, 4 p.m. Pacific. And that is The Last Dope Intellectual featuring Dr. Sharice Burden-Stelly, CBS. We have collaborated. I'm happy to support her new program, which is going to quote unquote air on this channel as part of an expanding a group of folks that will officially launch in its full expansive detailed arrival on the 17th of this month, which is also, of course, Dr. Huey P. Newton's birthday. So to celebrate Black History Month, to celebrate Dr. Huey P. Newton and his impact on the world, continuing impact on the world, and his presentation of Black power. We're going to make that special announcement on February 17th to commemorate all of that. So please stick around. Please like, share, and subscribe. Make sure you do that here and at imixwhatilike.org so you don't miss anything, and at imixwhatilike for all your relevant social media. And if you haven't joined this channel as a member, please consider doing so, and definitely please consider when you get the full announcement on the 17th. But please, tomorrow, on the I Mix What I Like, currently named I Mix What I Like YouTube channel, 7:00 p.m. be on hand for the premiere of The Last Dope Intellectual featuring Dr. Sharice Burden-Stelly. So very excited about that. Now, all that said, I want to turn to our next guest, someone who I've had the pleasure of interviewing a number of times, and I want to say, as I've been trying to, as we highlight some of the academics I bring on this platform, I will not claim to be in this man's circle of friends, which I think is an important point I'll come to in a minute. We're not, on each other's email groups and whatever groups and Christmas, holiday group, whatever it is, whatever. We're not hanging out like that. But at the same time, I have been tremendously influenced by this next scholar. And to the point I'm getting at, he has been gracious enough not only to give his time through these interviews and presentations to my classes over the years, but even in a moment of, I don't know, some kind of desperation, probably too strong a word, but a moment of need in my department, given his work with, as we'll talk about in a moment, the Media Education Foundation. He made available to us and our students a treasure trove of documentaries and media literacy and critical media literacy work. So that kind of collegiality, I think, is important to highlight, especially among people who don't necessarily know each other particularly well or aren't in each other's inner circles. And it doesn't always happen. Frankly, it does not always happen. It certainly doesn't happen enough. And of course, I'm talking about Dr. Sut Jhally, who is a professor, who many things I should say, is a professor of communication at University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and founder and executive director of the Media Education Foundation. He is one of the leading scholars looking at the role played by advertising and popular culture in the processes of social control and identity construction. This is particular to my class, even to my class on the world of hip hop, all of whom should be in attendance here today. Or who will have to see this in its replay. That particular point is remarkably relevant to that class, as we will see this semester. He is also the author of numerous books and articles on media, including The Codes of Advertising and Enlightened Racism. He is also an award-winning teacher, a recipient of the Distinguished Teaching Award at the University of Massachusetts, where the student newspaper has also voted him the best professor. In addition, he has been awarded the Distinguished Outreach Award and was selected to deliver a distinguished faculty lecture in 2007. He is perhaps best known as the producer and director of a number of films and videos, including Dreamworlds, Desire, Sex, Power, and Music Video, Tough Guise, Media Violence, and the Crisis of Masculinity, and Hijacking Catastrophe, 9/11 and the Fear of Selling American Empire. And that deal with issues ranging from gender, sexuality, and race to commercialism, violence, and politics. Born in Kenya, raised in England, educated in graduate studies in Canada. He currently lives in Northampton, Massachusetts, and he's joining us here this afternoon. Dr. Sut Jhally, welcome. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, pleasure to be. It's a pleasure to see you again. I haven't spoke to you for quite a while. So it's
been a long time.
Nice.
It's been too long. Yeah, so I appreciate that. Thank you very much. So there's a lot, obviously, that I would want to talk with you about, but I wanted to start with something, if I could, because I listed a number of the documentaries that you've been involved with, and thankfully been involved with. But I also wanted to start with a more recent documentary, The Occupation of the American Mind, and in particular because of something I heard you say in an interview not terribly long ago, which I thought was. Honestly, I felt you were being harsh on yourself, but I thought it was an interesting statement that I wanted to start with, where you said you thought you were a coward. You referred to yourself as a coward for not taking up the issue of Palestine sooner, I guess, earlier in your career. And you shared a story about the late Edward Said that sort of prompted that feeling. And I was wondering if you could start with sharing that story with us here today, and then to talk about why you felt that way, and maybe what the occupation of the American mind is meant to do to maybe as a response.
Sure. Yeah. It's. I was talking about the reluctance that academics, or almost everyone has, to discuss the Israel-Palestine conflict. And to especially, address it in a critical way. And I thought back to my own history on this. I've actually just retired from UMass.
Oh, wow. Well, congratulations. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm now a professor emeritus, but I teach a course, it hasn't made much difference, especially in these times. So I've been a professor at UMass, for like 30 years now. And teaching courses on propaganda and ideology and media and international relations, and how the media cover international issues. And during the first 10 years of my teaching those things, I had never dealt with Israel-Palestine. I hadn't looked at media representations of the Middle East. And this really came home to me, like, why hadn't I done this? It was in the back of my mind. And then in I think it was about 1996, I was at an event that was honoring this great Pakistani American intellectual, Iqbal Ahmed, who was one of the great, third world liberation thinkers. And he was teaching at Hampshire College, which is a college close to me. And Edward Said, the great Edward Said, came to speak at this event that was honoring Iqbal. And when Edward got up, when Said got up, and again, if you don't know who Edward Said is, look him up, because he is one of the kind of founders of post-colonial theory. I mean, he's one of the he's one of the giants of the 20th century when it comes to intellectual issues. And Said got up, and when he got up, he had tears running down his eyes, and he said, the reason I'm here today is because when the rest of the left and when other progressives forgot the Palestinians, Iqbal did not. And Iqbal talked about, what Israel has done to the Palestinians and Palestinian human rights. He kept talking about it, even at great academic cost to himself. And I said, and Said had tears running down his eyes, because it was just like in this time that that Iqbal was one of the people that expressed solidarity, even when it wasn't popular. And I thought to myself at that time, I was watching this, I thought to myself, why haven't here I am? I was already a tenured full professor, and it was like, why haven't I dealt with this issue? Okay, if you're dealing with issues of propaganda and international relations, the prime case is the way in which Israel has controlled the discourse in the US to make it appear as though Israel is the victim and not the aggressor in this conflict. And it's like, okay, why haven't I dealt with it? And I realized it was because I was, if you deal with these issues, you're going to get attacked, and you're going to be called a racist. You're going to be called an anti-Semite. You're going to be called all kinds of things. You're going to be called a bigot. You're going to be called a Nazi, and that fear had stopped me from really dealing with this in any kind of in any kind of way. And I just realized at that point, what's the point of tenure? Which is what I had. What's the point of tenure if you don't use it? What's the point of the intellectual protection you have, which very few people have? And if academics who have tenure don't use this, what's the point of it? And I realized I was being intellectually dishonest and a coward at that time. And at that point, I said, it's time to get real and deal with these issues. And that's when I started to deal with Israel-Palestine. Not because there's anything anti-Israel about it, but if you're dealing with issues of propaganda and public relations, then this is the prime case to study. And that's how I got into it. It actually wasn't through the conflict; it was actually through the media representations of it, which then leads you into thinking about the conflict in much more general ways. And since that time, I'm really happy to say I did a film with Edward not long after, which again I would recommend to anyone. It's actually on for free on YouTube. If you look up Edward Said on Orientalism, and if you put my name into it, you will see this documentary that I did. I introduced it. I was a lot younger looking at in those days, which is almost 20 years ago now. And we did a film, but I also did a film a few years later called Peace, Propaganda, and the Promised Land, which is also on YouTube, so you can watch that for free, which is about the propaganda around this. And then just 4 years ago, we did an update on that, a new film called The Occupation of the American Mind, Israel's PR war on America, which again followed up on this. And so one of the reasons I kept working on it is because very few other people are. And I have protection. I can't lose my job. I can be called lots of nasty names, which I've been doing, but that's, you can handle that. And that's the responsibility of intellectuals, the responsibility of progressives at an academic, in institutions that have that protection, to raise questions that can't be raised elsewhere. And so I teach about it in my classes, and I do these films on it. So that's the story. Started from this realization that I was, succumbing to the pressure, succumbing to the exact thing that I then ended up studying, and to figure out why is it that so many people are silent about this.
Yeah, and it can certainly be sort of an insidious pressure too. I mean, it's not. I mean, it doesn't. Anyway, I appreciate that. I get it. It just happens. People just start making decisions about what they focus on, not, and it's anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It wasn't it wasn't like, really on my mind until, I mean, Ed, when I heard Said talk about it, that's when it became clear. And one of the other reasons people don't want to talk about it, and I think this is actually the case just for ordinary people, they don't really want to have an opinion, or because I think they don't know enough. Because it's presumed that this history is so complex and you have to be an expert to be involved in it. And I've kind of fallen into that. And when I started to really look into it, in fact, the Israel-Palestine conflict is one of the simplest conflicts to explain. There's nothing confusing about it. Israel is a colonial settler project. Their aim is the aim of the Israeli state for a long, long time, has been essentially to make sure that the Palestinians have no rights, and that they're looking to establish control between the sea and the river, which is the phrase that often gets other people into trouble. But they want to establish total control within that, and it's not a difficult history. And once you realize it's not a difficult history, then it becomes absolutely clear which side any progressive should be on. And what Israel is doing through its public relations, and this is what our films are about, is to confuse that very simple history, and to try and turn it around on its head.
So I maybe we can come back to some of the details, particularly when I check for questions and comments in the chat. But or if you want to just come back to it on your own. But I did also want to ask you a few other things, including about how I've titled this how I thought to just title this interview, "Constructing Consciousness." So I thought I would just ask you to explain, even though I've given this interview that title, I was wondering if you could explain what that phrase means to you, given your extensive work again in advertising, or what McLuhan called the vast military operation of advertising, propaganda, ideology, and so on. What does constructing consciousness mean?
Yeah, I think that's a good it's a good title. So some of the earliest critical thinkers actually talked about the consciousness industry, and about how consciousness is controlled in this industrial process. And for me, the basis of it is that, in one sense, consciousness, that is perception, becoming conscious of the world, or understanding the world, is always a social process, and therefore is always constructed. That's part of what we do as human beings. Is, if reality simply imprinted itself on our heads, then everyone would have the same understanding of reality. But in fact, something stands between us and our understanding of the world out there, which is the categories of thought. And so if you can control the categories of thinking, you can control the categories through which people think about the world, you can control them in their own minds. I always go back to there's a quote by the Chinese philosopher Confucius, who was once asked. He said, if you were ever to run the state, excuse me, I should really. I should have turned that off before I came. He was once asked, if you were ever to rule the state, run the state, what would you do? And he answered. He said he would, quote, rectify the language. And what he meant by that was, if you control the language, if you control the categories of thought, control the categories through which people express themselves, you don't need to have soldiers on street corners. You can control people in their imaginations and in their heads. And essentially, that's what American public relations realized, or that was the understanding they came up with early in the 20th century. That if you can,
Professor Jhally, I'm sorry to interrupt, but this sounds like a sci-fi movie, right? Doesn't this sound like lunatic conspiracy theory that people are going to construct someone's imagination?
But someone has to construct it. I mean, that's the thing. When people say conspiracy theory, they're trying to, but someone constructs the world. I mean, that's the nature of, the world doesn't fall fully formed from heaven. Someone constructs it, interests construct it. And if you want to see what those interests, what those interests are and how they maintain power, you have to look at the ways in which, the ways in which they make sure that the population does not rebel, that the population thinks about itself, thinks about the system in which they are the losers. They think about themselves as, not as the losers and as the greatest system, the greatest system on earth. So I don't think it's conspiracy theory. It's the way the world works, which is it works through people, constructing the world according to their own interests, which is the history of the history of the world.
Again, one of the reasons for my horrific, you talk about your cell phone. One of the reasons for my horrific beginning to this live stream was being sort of caught up in a class that I was just coming from, where one of the discussions we were having was the students were asking sort of why was what happened on the 6th here at the U.S. Capitol sort of not happening more often and in larger number. And, and I just sort of suggested to the point I think you're getting at here, that one of the reasons that all of this inequality is being held together through messaging, to the extent that it is, and so I wonder what you think about that, or how in what ways you have been looking to interpret maybe what happened on the 6th last month, or what is happening in the country and the world now more broadly.
Yeah, well, that's a big question. I mean, but going back to the issue of the way in which people think about inequality, I think that's what, if you go back to, let's go back to Trumpism and the rise of Trump. I mean, what Trump recognized, whether it was deliberate or not, was that, neoliberalism and the economic order we live in, has created a lot of losers, and there's a lot of people whose lives have not been improved by neoliberalism. And what he did was, and no one was talking to them. That was the thing. The Republican Party wasn't talking to them, and the Democratic Party was not talking to them, because the Democratic Party itself is beholden to its own, to its own funders, which is finance capital. And so the two main parties were not dealing with, the experience of a great deal of people in the country. And Trump comes along and says, actually, the people and he was especially framing it to, not to everyone, but especially to his, the white Republican base, was to say, the reason why your lives are not so great is because of those immigrants. The reason your lives are not so great is because of these black people. Their lives that you used to have a great life. That's the Make America Great Again. It used to be great before these black people got uppity and demanded their own rights, and before women got uppity and demanded rights, and before gay people. Let's go back to those 50s, that time in the 50s. And so he's giving them an explanation, or he's giving some of them. I think it is also, I don't want to overplay how I think there's some very powerful people behind Trump as well, and there's and we know the people who were involved in the Capitol invasion. They were not all working class people who were
That's right. That's right.
I mean that this is a coalition, and that's why I think it's what Gramsci called an historic bloc. It is made up of many, many different kinds of people, but they are the most powerful political bloc. But going back to your question, what Trump did was he gave those people an answer, and he says, that these are the people to blame, and that's what they've latched onto. I always at this point, I remember back in 2015 or 2016, I heard a talk by Benjamin Jealous, who is he used to work with Bernie Sanders, an ex-head of the NAACP, and he's really a very, very impressive character. And he came to speak at the university, and he said, he was actually on the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016, and he says, when you work on the Bernie Sanders campaign and you go travel around the country, the last thing you do is to actually go to the campaign event itself, because Bernie gives the same speech no matter where he goes. And he says, I'm not sure, I'm not just saying, he gives the same themes. He gives literally word for word the same speech wherever he goes. And they were down in Appalachia somewhere. They were down in West Virginia. They were down in deep kind of white redneck country. And Bernie was speaking there. And Bernie said to Benjamin Jhally, said, you should come to the event tonight. And Benjamin Jhally said, why? I've seen you speak 100 times. I know what you're going to say. He said, you should come. You should come. And so Benjamin Jhally went. And, Bernie gave exactly the same speech that he gave, for example, in Detroit, the 2 nights before, to wild acclaim. And he gives this speech to these white, rednecks, working class, and he gets exactly the same response. And he gets the response because he's giving a different answer to where inequality comes from. And he's pointing, the reason that this inequality, the reason you have the lives you have is not because of black people and not because of immigrants, it's because of corporations. And when that is explained, and then when, people latch onto that. And so Trumpism, and that's what Trumpism kind of, or at least a big base, a big chunk of it, is giving that explanation. And I think it'd be not easy, but I think if you deal with people's real experiences and then give them a different way to interpret it, that you could bring over a large section of that. Not everyone, because there is also a big chunk of white supremacy. There's people hanging on to their whiteness, and no matter what you say to them, they're willing to die for their whiteness. They're willing to die. There's a really interesting book. This came out last year called Dying of Whiteness, which actually is interviews with a lot of white working class people who will literally, for example, turn down healthcare, an expansion of healthcare, which would save them, which would literally save their lives, because they don't want it to go to black people. And so they are literally willing to die they're willing to die for their whiteness.
So it's funny you shared that story about Bernie Sanders, because on the one hand, the first thought I have is it makes his constant support of Biden and Pelosi and them even more difficult to understand or agree with or whatever. But I also was wondering, thinking about Biden's former, I guess, boss or partner, Obama, and what you have said about Obama and the Cosby effect. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and maybe I don't know, share what that might mean for a prediction about the next 4 years under Biden, if there is a way to connect the two. But I definitely would want you to talk a little bit about both Obama and the Cosby effect, as you have done over the years.
Sure, yeah. Obama is a really interesting, he's more than, he's an interesting character. Is that if you, in fact, I was listening to Paul Jay, the journalist with the Real News Network the other day, and he said what he does when Obama was, rising to power, and he said what he would do, he would make it a point not to listen to Obama, but to read his speech. Because he said he's so charming and he's so charismatic that charisma, in fact, hides the very kind of mainstream things that he's actually saying. Because remember, Obama was simply I would say a center, very, very mainstream Democrat. He was not a liberal. He was not a radical in any sense. And yet he sold himself that way. And so the journalist Chris Hedges, talks about Obama as a brand, that he sold himself in this emotional way, and the brand, you latch on with your emotions to the brand, whatever, we can be better, or whatever the phrase was, and you don't actually,
we can.
You don't pay attention to the actual basis of it. And that's the way brands work. Brands work emotionally. And essentially, Obama worked emotionally. He worked emotionally, I think, for large numbers of black people. He saw a way to power through that, and he worked also for white people. And this was the Cosby effect. The Cosby effect was, here is a black man that we can support because he's non-threatening. Here is a black man that is that is one of us. Here is a black man that is, and it was that non-threatening aspect, and that was the great bargain that Obama made. He said, "I will make you feel good about American racism. You can vote for me, and you're no longer a racist." But you don't have to change your behavior. You don't have to change your policies. You don't have to change anything that's real. You just have to go into the voting booth and vote for me for one day, and you will feel good about it. And that's exactly what Cosby did. Cosby made people feel good, made white people especially feel good, because they couldn't be racist, because look, they're inviting the Huxtables into their living room every single day. They love the Huxtables. You know, they love Michael Jordan. These days they love LeBron. They love, right? How can I be a racist when I love these, you know, individual black people? Not that, but I'm not willing to support policies that help the 40 million black people that are not in this small segment. And so that was the way Obama worked as well. He made black people and white people especially feel good about themselves without having to do anything about the reality of race in America. Because the only way to deal, if you want to deal with the effects of racism, you've got to deal with the redistribution of wealth and the redistribution of power. You've got to deal with some basic things that are not just about you feeling good. And that, in that sense, I think Obama set us back a great deal. I mean, he may have made you feel good about, being able to be identifying with this black man, but he also made you feel not responsible for what was going on.
I think it's perfect also that you mentioned LeBron, because I'm wondering, so then clearly when LeBron listens to Barack Obama, and who tells the NBA players not to strike and to go back and play and just put the slogans on your shirt, and then LeBron goes back and plays with, just putting Black Lives Matter or, say her name on his shirt, then if I understand you correctly, we could argue that actually makes his white NBA fan feel even better, that's even less threatening than some might think it's seeing him put on a shirt with a slogan on it, given that he's not making any specific appeal to a redistribution or a threat to power.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the whole. I mean, there's a symbolic. I think I want to always be clear on this. I mean, I think it is very significant that the symbolism of taking the knee. I think it's a powerful symbol. But if that's all it remains, if it remains just at that level and doesn't then go to the next level, which is changing policy. I mean, racism isn't just what's in your head. I mean, we could wake up tomorrow and we could have no racist thoughts, and racism and the society would still be structured along the terms of race. And until you can get past this notion that racism is something that's in your head, and you've got to get to this notion that racism is structured within the society, that slavery has structured the society. And until you deal with those structures, until you deal with, on a very basic level, until you deal with how schools are funded through real estate taxes on a local basis, and we figure out some way of making that absolutely equal so that every American child has access to the same level of education, then you can talk all you want about not being racist, but it will make no difference whatsoever. You've got to get to that level, and I think a lot of white Americans are simply not willing to go there. They're not willing to go to what it actually will take to dismantle racism, which is giving up their own power and to really make America something like a meritocracy, which of course it's not right now.
Mm-hmm. A couple other things I at least want to raise.
Sorry, one other question. Just let me. Can I just say about Biden?
Sure. Oh yeah,
again,
please, of course.
Yeah,
right. That's
I mean, again, I must admit, when the primaries were going on and when it became clear that he was going to win, the thought of going into a voting booth and voting for Joe Biden literally made me throw up. I mean, the thought of it was literally, I just can't do this, because the history of Joe Biden, right? If you look at what he's actually done, he's a horrible. He's a warmonger. He was the main representative in Congress for the Iraq War.
Yeah.
Right. He's the main representative of finance capital and of banks and of the credit card companies. He was the main person in Congress behind the crime bill. I mean, his history. He is a war criminal. And yet here we are now, where we are faced with, like, this is what as you said, Bernie was behind him. And I think that was simply a kind of anti-Trump thing. I mean, that was a very strategic, like we have to get rid of Trump first. And if that means that we have to support someone like Biden, then our fight is going to be much easier under Biden than it is under Trump. And I don't think Bernie has any illusions on that. And I think we'll see in the next 4 years that when as Bernie, I think is going to keep constructing his own coalition. We'll see the conflict with Biden. But the question is Biden's? I mean, will Biden change? Because for him to be able to solve the problems, he's got to go beyond neoliberalism. He's got to go beyond austerity. And I think the good side there, he's got to be bold, and he's got to be a kind of FDR figure. And he'll become an FDR figure, if the pressure comes from the left. I think this is an open question. I don't know if he'll do it, but the early signs are good. The fact that he wants to do, a 1.9 trillion, COVID intervention, and is looking into, investment in infrastructure. This is what is necessary for him to survive and for the country to survive. Whether he will do it or not. Domestically, he may do it. The other issue around Biden, and I would urge people to really pay attention, this is around foreign policy and what they do around the world, because the people he's appointing are old Cold warriors.
That was honestly going to be my unfortunate, where we would just have to disagree. My thoughts on his domestic policy. I mean, he's appointed, Obama's whole crew. Clinton and Obama's whole crew. So, and already rolled the troops into Syria and all that. And then I also think he's, punking out on the stimulus thing. But so we'll just, it doesn't matter to me for this conversation. It doesn't matter to me. We won't agree on this. It just doesn't matter. I don't disagree with you. As I said, I'm trying to be hopeful. Yeah, I can't. I can't. I mean, anyway, but and that's fine. I honestly, really, I was just interested because I don't know if it was, I hadn't really thought about it until just before we started talking today. I mean, I knew I wanted to ask you about Obama and the Cosby effect, but I really wasn't sure if there was something that sort of approach leads us to conclude about Biden, or how he might fit in, or if at all. And I was just thinking of it. So anyway, that's where I was just. But if there's a way of analyzing what maybe he learned in how to approach, or the handlers of Obama who are now helping him learned in developing an approach. I don't know. But that's fine. I think what he has learned is that you can play the symbolic game when it comes to race, without having to play any game, without having to make any real changes. Yeah. And for me, it's the issues around race. All these workshops around around microaggressions or feeling good around it. Yeah, that's all very well and good. But unless you're willing to change policy. Right? Unless you're willing to change policy, then it will have no impact whatsoever. It will just make you feel good. It'll make you feel good and make you feel, I took this workshop, I'm not a racist. And I think that's where that's I think the way to judge Biden is on the actual real investment that he makes and how it impacts. So one of the reasons, well, one of the uses to which I want to put this conversation is for my class this semester, well, two of them actually. One of them is on public public opinion and persuasion, and the other one is on more about the history and the world according to hip hop, where we'll look at the music industry, and where I know you have done historically some work. We mentioned more documentaries in the intro. And I'm wondering if you could say a word about where your analysis of our media environment takes you when you look specifically at the music industry, either historically or to the extent you've been paying attention to it in its most current formation.
Yeah, I haven't really been thinking about the music industry that much. I mean, I think if you look at the current media environment, you've got to really come to terms with what's happening online, and it's no longer about the mainstream media and television. It's about Facebook and it's about the online. And I think if you look at and oftentimes people say, well, we're in a totally different world right now. We're not in the old world of propaganda. We're now in a new world of social media where people can construct their own worlds, etc. And what I always tell people is, okay, we have to essentially the way of understanding anything is following the money. Where is the money coming from, and what has changed within this new environment? And in fact, nothing has changed. And this goes back to the analysis of advertising. It is advertising that is driving everything. That the organization of Facebook, the organization of Twitter, the organization of Snapchat, the organization of Instagram, all of that is tied up to collecting eyeballs. Nowadays, it's collecting eyeballs to sell to advertisers, and it's also collecting data, which we are giving for free to these corporations, and about how they can target us better. And so there is, for me, there's almost, it's actually it's become the kind of the absolute, the logic has gone to its extreme lengths now, in which the media has turned into nothing. There's no content anymore. There's no content because we create the content. We're doing the work of media for them. We're creating the content so that our eyeballs so that advertisers can buy our eyeballs. In terms of music and hip hop, I think you're in a much better place to talk about that.
I think you said it quite well. That historically, whether it's the more overt relationship that evolved, and particularly in the early 2000s between advertisers and music industry reps for the rap world, where they were literally paying rappers to put reference to their products and lyrics. Or to the extent that the way you point out, so much hasn't changed, that, as I keep trying to point out, Leo Cohen, who many of us thought destroyed hip hop quite well in the 80s with his relationship to Def Jam, is right back running YouTube's music business. So he's right back in even a more prominent place musically, running the largest music platform in the world right now. So and fostering many of the same kind of relationships between corporations and artists to, I think, negatively impact cultural expression. But anyway, so it was just sort of where I was wanting to I don't know, just to ask you to talk a little bit about the broader, that bigger picture. And I thought, and I think you did quite well, especially when we put it in conjunction with the documentary. I know you had involvement with The Illusionists, which is another tremendous, I think, piece of work that shows the impact of this advertising globally in the so-called modern era as well. So anyway, that was it. The last actual topic I wanted to raise with you before we ended up closing was. I have to ask you about, and I just saw one of your later interviews with him, the late great Stuart Hall, with whom I know you had a tremendous relationship. And I was wondering if you could just say a few words about Stuart Hall and where his work in cultural studies should be still helping inform us today.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Well, one thing a few years ago, I had this great discovery. I realize it must be like when archaeologists find something, they've been searching for their whole lives. But I found that one of the great articles is the Stuart Hall wrote. So for those people who don't know, Stuart Hall is a British West Indian scholar. He essentially invented and created the term, created the discipline of cultural studies from his work in the late 1970s on. And he is a foundational thinker when it comes to issues around race, but also specifically, for me, his great contribution was about thinking about what the new configuration of neoliberalism is all about. And so Stuart Hall is, for me, is, whenever I think of it, when something happens, I always think, okay, what would Stuart say? How would Stuart analyze this? Because he had a particular way of analyzing this. Anyway, so Stuart was this, for me, and I think for a lot of people, this very central intellectual political figure around issues of race and especially of Marxism. And so one of the great articles that he wrote was in 2004, was called "Through the Prism of an Intellectual Life." And if people have not read it, I would really urge you to go and read this. It was a text of a lecture that he gave in 2004 at a conference, and I discovered that there was film of this lecture that he gave, and I never even knew that it existed. And again, Stuart is one of the great speakers you will ever hear. And so I found this lecture, which I then managed to get, and I did some mastering of it, and we just released it. And so if people want to go to YouTube, they can just put in Stuart Hall and then Prism, P-R-I-S-M, of an Intellectual Life, and this lecture will come up, and I highly recommend people to, because in it is a way of looking at the world. And it is a way of thinking about the importance of theory and then the importance of power in thinking about where we are. So Stuart was that's what Stuart Hall was. He was one of the great thinkers about our present configuration, our present right-wing configuration. He was the first one in the 1970s and 1980s to come up with an analysis of Thatcherism, which was the philosophy, which was the political movement around Margaret Thatcher, which was the same as the political movement, not the same, but it was related to the movement around Ronald Reagan, and which, transformed our lives. And he came up with this term.
That's one way of putting it, for sure.
he came up with this term, authoritarian populism. And if you want to understand Donald Trump, authoritarian populism is the way to understand it, which is this strange combination of authoritarianism but connected with a very popular appeal, where it appeals to large numbers of people. So for me, Stuart was one of the major. If you want to understand where we are right now, Stuart Hall would be a very, very good place to start, and this lecture would be a very, very good place to start.
Right on. I'm just so I don't know if a few minutes. I don't know exactly what your time is like. I just want to. I've exhausted my list of questions. I just wanted to quickly see if there were any in the chat that we could address. But I certainly appreciate you taking the time. It's always good to catch up with you. And I've certainly learned and continue to learn so much from the work you've been putting out.
Sorry, could I, if we have a couple of minutes, let me just say one thing.
Yeah, sure.
Around issues of, this last year has been pretty incredible around race. We had the demonstrations around the death of George Floyd last summer. And then we have the Capitol Hill insurrection. And I think those two events are the history of race in America. They're the history, in that every time there is any attempt by Black people to highlight issues of oppression, there is always a white backlash. That's the history. Whether it is, slavery, then is followed by prison labor, and then followed by Jim Crow. The civil rights movements of the 1960s, followed by Ronald Reagan, and followed by Nixon and Ronald Reagan. Obama is followed by Trump. So that's always the model. The model is always, what Carol Anderson, calls white rage. And I think if you want to understand where we are right now, you've got to look at what happened on January the 6th in relationship to what happened last summer, and those incredible demonstrations the street demonstrations that took place, which for many of us were, like inspirational, and for half the country they were a nightmare. And what we saw, I think, on January 6th was that nightmare coming to that nightmare. The people who had that nightmare acting out. The people who had that nightmare thinking, okay, this is the way we get out of this nightmare. So that black demands, white backlash is where we are right now. And I think you have to understand. Again, there's nothing new about Donald Trump. Okay?
Correct.
Make America Great Again was Ronald Reagan's slogan.
That's right.
Okay? And so this idea that Trump is somehow different. The only way Trump is different is he made explicit what was implicit in everything else. And so you can't understand anything at the present time without looking at the history of America. And going back, you have to go back, I think, 500 years to really look at it and to understand how slavery is embedded in the structures we have today.
Do you, we're asked here if any thoughts, obviously you have some experience outside the United States. Any thoughts on this question here about quickly expanding the conversation to be more international? Racism isn't unique to the United States. Is there any, some have maybe made comparisons to what between Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. I don't know. Is there anything in the world that or anything related to what we've been talking about here that you would want to connect to something happening or what you see happening in the rest of the world? Or
sure. Well, the first thing I would say, one of the things I would say is what Stuart Hall always used to say, which is there's no such thing as racism. There's racisms. That is, racism is always very particular, has particular histories in different places. And so you can't make any kind of general statements about it. You have to do a particular analysis of particular countries. But in terms of looking at what's happening globally, I mean, we live in global times. And I don't think it's any accident that you're seeing the rise of similar types of right-wing leaders. Whether it is in the US, whether it is in Britain, either with Boris Johnson or Brexit. The Brexit vote, whether it is in Hungary, whether it is in Brazil, that you have the rise of these right-wing leaders everywhere. And I think one of the reasons for that is the globalization. The neoliberalism is a global phenomenon. And the neoliberalism has had an effect on countries, all around the world. And what it's done is it's essentially, there are some winners in neoliberalism, in the neoliberal structures we have, and there are a lot of losers. And the people when I say losers, people whose lives are worse. And you can see that's what is common to all these societies. And those people that have lost, if you can appeal to them about their loss, and then say the reason your loss, the reason you're losing is because these people are winning, and these are people these immigrants who are winning. They're the ones who are causing your, then that's the rise of right-wing politics internationally. So yes, I think when we look internationally, I think you have to look very particularly at individual situations. But there is also something that is now linking them together, because we do live in global times, and there are our economic structures are global. And so you have to be able to look at both global, this is a trite thing to say, it's the global and the local, and how those things go together. And that's what Stuart Hall was a genius at, was bringing those two things together.
And Blood Honey, I appreciate all the requests for international focus, but I would just want to remind everybody that we did start with Israel and Palestine. So Professor Sut Jhally, Eddie, look, I thank you very much for joining me. And hopefully I won't take this long to invite you back, but it's been a pleasure to catch up with you again. And again, thank you for all your great work and that I continue to learn from and use, and that all of us can. So I appreciate it. Thank you very
much. Thanks for the invitation. Anytime you want to invite me back, I'll be happy to come back.
All right, folks, you heard him say it. It's taped, recorded live. So, okay. Professor Jhally, thank you very much. Take good care. We'll catch you next time. Thank you very much. Everybody, thank you for joining me today. Please come back tomorrow when we have Dr. Mark Blythe, who Brown University economist and author of Angrynomics, co-author of Angrynomics. Going to get into a little bit of some of the economics where I think he has offered up a practical solution for what I put broadly and vaguely as a solution, suggestion, myth of buying power. We'll see. I think he's maybe the perfect person to talk to see if I got anything right and if we can have a practical solution to get that GDP redistributed. So anyway, please check back. Remember, tomorrow, 7 o'clock, February 5th, 7 p.m. Eastern, the launch, the premiere of The Last Dope Intellectual with Dr. Sharice Bernan-Stelly right here at the currently named I Mix What I Like YouTube channel. You can also see it if you're at imixwhatilike.org. So thanks again, everybody. And as Fred Hampton used to say to you, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody. And we'll catch you in the whirlwind, as I believe someone named Garvey also once said. All right, peace, everybody. Catch you next time.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.